Good morning. The fifth speaker. We're really testing your absorptive capacity here. I hope that I still keep it sufficiently interesting, and then next comes discussion and coffee, so I'm the last here. And I want to talk about climate finance and how climate finance can become a catalyst to climate-smart agriculture. I do not want to talk about the big numbers, about the investment needs into the agricultural sector. I won't talk about UNFCCC negotiations. I rather would like to inspire you a bit about what can be done now, because we do not have the time to wait for the UNFCCC to agree on anything in any sector. And it is also the UNFCCC may give us accounting frameworks and help at the end to channel some finance. It will not solve the climate problem. It will also not devise the recipes of what climate-smart agriculture means. So what we need, and what also the negotiators need, and what people in development organizations need, are examples and pilots of what we are talking about. And I'm convinced that in the context of limited funding that we have here, there is sufficient funding available to test some of these approaches here. But we also face some challenges. We know, in particular for smallholder agriculture, in particular in your countries and your constituencies, the absolute priority in climate change is adaptation. It is climate resilience. Nobody can really expect poor smallholding farmers to mitigate climate change. We don't even have a legitimacy to go there and expect this of smallholder farmers. However, we have the problem that climate finance is much easier to access in mitigation. Why is that? Because we have MRV systems, and MRV systems is a bit, one of the conditions of climate finance, in the sense that you can measure performance. And mitigation, by measuring tons of emissions or tons of emission reduced or absorbed, has a metric. Adaptation and climate resilience doesn't have a metric. It is highly site-specific, it is complex, and. So the activities tend to gravitate toward mitigation. And although the carbon market doesn't really work for farmers in smallholding systems, nevertheless, it seems to be easier to pilot this, which doesn't work, as we know, but because it has at least a certain logic that can be followed. So what we need now is to define pilots that combine, and that is climate-smart agriculture, that combine and hopefully have a primary focus on climate resilience, but also have mitigation benefits, just because it allows us more easily at this point to access finance and also to leverage private sector finance. Oops. No. Sorry. So the policy context, we already heard about this. We have a global context, and incentives for climate-smart agriculture can be devised on any of these levels. The international level is the UNFCCC. The most relevant policy instruments, there are nationally appropriate mitigation actions, which are policies adopted on a voluntary basis by developing countries, which can include, or in many cases also already list, agriculture as a priority sector. We have RED, the reduced emissions of deforestation and degradation, which RED funds can benefit agriculture at any scenario where we have agriculture at the forest margin, and we have adaptation finance. All this, as I said, is not properly defined yet, but we can wait for this. And currently already donors and national governments work on testing various NAMA or RED type of activities, so one can access it and one can combine different approaches even without having clear rules on the UNFCCC. And again, if this is the only thing that you take home from my speech, don't wait for the UNFCCC. That is the most important, and there is partnerships and abilities to do something already now. For example, there are regional initiatives, and here the example is CADAP and NEPAD in Africa, but there exist similar attempts in other regions that look at streamlining CSA, so climate smart agriculture, into development plans. And it is these development plans and national agricultural plans that at the end will define the policy incentives for a transition to climate smart agriculture. And then we have, of course, a level underneath this, which is probably the most relevant at this point, which is demonstration activities and pilot projects, which now need to be tested, again, to inform the national policy development. So the four elements, or the four most prominent elements of coming up with a climate smart agriculture program is first an priority on assessment. So what is it? This is collecting data and first understanding what's going on. That is a problem that in many countries there is insufficient data on weather and exposure to weather events, on vulnerability, but also on mitigation potential. Second, pilot programs. And the pilot programs can start while still data are being collected. And similarly, we need to work on institutional readiness with development partners that build the capacities in institutions to implement climate smart agriculture programs. And we need to work on institutional capacities in donor agencies as much as in national governments. My experience from my work is that in agriculture, those that work also in donor or development banks that work on agriculture are not yet ready to understand fully or to the climate change challenge and to integrate into the existing programs. And it would already be an enormous benefit if the existing agricultural programs would come with an MRV system that would tell us what is the climate impact and what are the benefits of it, so that we start screening on whether what we are doing now is making the problem worse or contributes to the solution. But we are not there yet, and we are not there yet from both ends. And then finally, once we have the data and the institutions and the pilots, then we can look into scaling up the finance. But that is probably, still ahead of us a few years. When designing pilot activities or programs, we need to analyze the barriers, and its investment and financial barriers are one of the most important ones in smallholder agriculture systems, but there are many more, and they are specific. They are context and country and region and crop and farming system specific. And we can only develop a program if we know what is the bottleneck and how to address it. So this assessment of the particular barriers is the condition and the first step for then coming up with an intervention. Once there is an assessment on what is needed and what the problems are, specific incentives can be devised to address this. And this is now on the basis, this is a slide that looks more at what governments can do, or what can instruments and tools that can work and defined at the international level. They can be defined partly in cooperation with donor agencies, but they always need to be anchored in national development priorities. And it could be, we have categorized I have categorized now these incentives in four main broad categories. That is the outputs and results-based payments, that is payment for ecosystem services, and carbon markets as a subcategory. But again, I would not focus too much on carbon markets. What is important, though, that the carbon markets have developed a number of protocols to assess climate benefits in terms of tons of emission absorbed in farming systems that are useful even if we do not rely on an instrument that in any way issues carbon credits that can be traded. So it gives us a good performance measure. And again, another thing that I would encourage everybody working in this, looking what is out there, the different tools, the different protocols, they may be developed in a completely different context, but they can still be very useful for our particular little demonstration activity. Then direct access to loans linked to CSA or to a transition can be various financial incentives, but at the end, and this is again longer term a bit, also remove perverse incentives that come with tariffs or taxes. The risk-sharing mechanism, insurances, guarantees, I come to that, and then other incentives for private investment, in particular also with foreign investment and working along supply chains. And with trading and big food corporation, there's quite a lot of interesting initiatives at the moment being developed, and they rely on supply chain reduction of emissions, and they are linked normally to labeling and certification programs. The Consumer Good Forum or other platforms that combine companies that have pledged to reduce their carbon footprint are interesting fora in this context. Again, supporting policy interventions. The payment for ecosystem services is probably something at the longer term. This requires institutional capacities. It also requires, for those that are targeted with PS programs, the ability to undertake the certain investment to be paid afterwards. And it also requires, of course, that there is budget in the national fiscal system to pay for this. So it's probably not the priority measure here. Set up transition funds. Transition funds are important. They help farmers to pick up the costs of the transition associated with the change in practice. And here again, the interesting thing also, in particular compared to RED or forest, where I worked a lot, is that in the transition to CSA, we have a clear measure of results, in the sense if the transition works, then it is clearly related to increased yields. Only if the project or the activity works, it has a benefit to the farmer, and the benefit to the farmer is certainly not a reduced emission. It is increased yields and a more resilient system. And if that works, he or she will never change back. But it takes, in most cases, it takes a couple of years until these benefits are there. And in this context, the transition funds that pick up of these costs are important. Similarly, specifically devised insurance or guarantee products that look at a longer maturity time and cover these additional costs. Again, there are examples, but I don't have so much time, so I need to wrap up or be a bit quicker. But there are also literature, and then the support of capacity building, transaction cost. This is a complicated slide, and it's my last slide. And it is also a slide which still had, which shows that I need myself technical assistance, because it still had a comment in it from my colleague, which is printed here, which you can ignore. It is coming from a previous version of that slide, and I had moved it with my mouse in a corner because I didn't know how to delete it, but it still pops up here. It shows how transparent we are or there's peer review in preparation of our presentations. What I wanted to say here is that is a slide that has been developed in the context of a Rockefeller-funded program to look how climate finance can help small farmers in Africa to become more climate resilient. And we have put here together or listed all the different entities that are normally involved in a farming operation. The extension service, the finance and corporations, the buyers, the trade organization. And in our analysis, when looking at, and we have developed an intervention, coffee in Ethiopia, cocoa in Ghana, and now coffee in Uganda, we normally come and start with a picture like this and say who is involved, and then we see where is the problem. Is there a lack of credit? Is there a lack of extension services? Is there a lack of labor? And then we try to come up with a project and activity that addresses that particular problem, and then go and develop an MRV system, a measurement reporting system, and with all that package we go to the donors and try to find finance for this, which is quite interesting. And normally it is welcomed by all involved, just for the simple reason that we need pilots and there is an interest in looking what can be done. So that is it. Thank you. And that's it.